Hello everyone, welcome to JS Kicks and my name is Deepak. Here in this tutorial, I'm going to be talking about selector, reducer, action, and I'm also going to be creating a few components in here. In those components, I'm also going to be making use of store. So now if you look closely over here in this particular screen, so now you see that you have a selector over here, and similarly we have an action over here, and then you have a reducer over here, and then a store over here. Right, so why is it arranged in the manner in which it is arranged right now? So there is a reason why it is done so. So if you look closely, the Redux architecture suggests that your component must not have store access directly. So each of these components that you see, or each of these entities that you see on the diagram on your screen right now, has a special purpose to solve, a special purpose to serve. Right, so for example, selector is written in order to select the store data in the component, right? So essentially, if you notice here, selector is only used inside a component, right? So now you can see that the selector is not really available in the action, in the reducer, in the effects, or anywhere else. Selector is only used in the component. Similarly, if you look closely over here, the action is something that is receiving an input from the component, right? So if you look at this, there is an arrow which is moving outside from the component and to the action, and the action is the one which is talking to reducer, which is written over here, and the reducer is the one which changes the store state, which is over here. Right, so now you can see by looking at this particular diagram. Now let me ask you a question here. All you need to do is look at this particular diagram carefully and try to answer the question, right? So let's say if you were to really change a store value for a particular application, how would you do it? So now if you look closely over here, you can see the arrows which are coming from store or going inside the store. Now you can try to answer this. I'll give you a 5 second to think about it, and then I'll answer the question. So time starts now. All right, so let me answer this question that I asked earlier. So if you look here, so if you need to change anything in the store change is only receiving input from the reducer, so no action can directly talk to store, and similarly no component can directly change the store. So how it is done, the component will initiate an action, and that action would basically be intercepted by a reducer, and that reducer is the one which is responsible to change the state inside the store. So how would you change the state inside your application using a component? Is through actions, right? So this is how it is. So if you look closely in this particular diagram, most of the question or most of the problems that you might face while try to understand how NGRX work or how Redux work would be answered if you just keep this particular diagram in your mind, right? So now I think we have understood how component changes the store, and similarly we have also spoken about selector, action, and so on and so forth, right? Now let's just talk about the effect. So how do you think that effect would be triggered? So now if you look closely again the same diagram, you would notice that the component has something called an action. The outside, the arrow which is moving away from component to the action is this, and if you look closely, the action is the one which is talking to effect, and effect is also talking to action, and then that action is again changing the reducer and hence the store, right? So how it is done, so a component will basically fire an action, and that action would trigger an effect, and that particular effect will talk to service, receive the data, and send it back to action, and then action would send it to reducer to update the state, and that's how the state of your application would be updated in case if you're using, or in case if you're using in case if you're using the effects, or rather something called asynchronous action, or if you're using side effects, right? So that's how this update would take place. We have briefly spoken about selector, reducer, action, component, store, effect, services. Now I'm going to be talking about each of these components and how do we code them, and also we'll try to create a component that'll use selector, action, and reducer, and we will see how it really functions in real-time application, right? So before I start anything, I would want to take your attention to the VS Code. So let me open the VS Code right up. All right. So we already have a skeleton available for one of the component, which is a students table. And in this particular folder, I'm going to be creating 3 files. So first is these students, and I'm also going to be making 3 different copies, and I'm also going to be changing the extension of these files little while later, right? So let me just do those. So copy, paste, paste, right? So let's change this one. Let's do a rename. HTML, and then the other one we are going to be making as CSS, right? And now I'm going to be writing the component level code which is required for this particular students tables to work. So in order to do this, I would want to again take you back to the browser, and on the browser I'm going to be opening the material table, and that material table, which is something that I'm going to be using in the application. And now I'm going to be using the material table. So let me open Angular material. Is the Angular material. I'm going to be looking at the components, and inside the components I'm looking at grid, right? So here is the table, right? So this is the table that we are going to be making, and this is the application that we are basically trying to mimic. And let me just log in to this application, and this is the table essentially that we are going to be building, right? So if you look at this particular grid, it has some of the details listed here pertaining to a student, which is country, name, city, subject. Or let me basically create an advanced version of it. What I'll do is I'll basically have roughly about 8 or roughly about 12 or 15 different properties for a student, and what I would do is basically try to include all those 15 properties here in that grid, right? So this is the application that we're going to be building essentially, and what we stand at currently is this. It's nothing in there. I've actually removed all the component for the app from the app component.html and our component in TS, and let me just try to create those, right? So let me take you back to the code editor, and here at the code editor, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be first of all creating an application, and first of all I'm going to be creating a grid. A grid is something which is essentially a material grid, right? So what code would be used is something that we will take up from the Angular material. So if you come here, if you come down, it's a tab. If you look at this, it's basically the mat table that we are going to be making a use of. And if you further come down, it has all the examples given in here as well, right? So yep. So before we start to use Angular material table, let's just see how we can basically implement this. So in order to implement this, you can see that the API, if you click on the API tab over here, it tells you that what do you really need in your application to in order to use this, right? So first of all, we'll have to import the material table module. So let me just copy this bit and go back to VS Code, and here at the VS Code we'll try to make use of this particular import, right? So let me open the TS file and then just put this here, save it, and leave it here for a moment. We'll come back to this and we'll try to create the remaining part of the code. So let me do table here first. Right, so I'm gonna be container, and inside the container I'm going to be making a material table. So let me put this right here, And inside this material table, I'm going to be having a few columns. So the first column I'm going to be having is the name column. In order to put a name column, what I need to do is just write down this and save this. The application is still running. It hasn't failed just yet. And I'm going to be making the other column, which is city column. So press to enter the city here. The next column I'm going to be putting is the country. Please note, the idea of this particular application is to basically tell you how ngrx work. So I'm not really going to be explaining how material library is functioning in this particular case, but then if I already have a few good tutorial available on my YouTube channel, and if you wish to know more about how material works and how Angular material library works and how it behaves, and if you want me to create step-by-step tutorial, please do write in the comment section below, and I'll try to cover this in a separate video tutorial. But for now, let's just focus on this particular thing and then try to include all the possible columns that we're going to be having. So there are a few other columns that I'm going to be putting in. So the next column I'm going to be putting in is subjects. So let me do this. The next one is passport declaration. And after this, I'm going to be putting in the fitness declaration. And after fitness declaration, I'm going to be putting in a course name, dates, and state. All right, now I'm going to be putting in the two table row, which are also essentially the table footer. So let me put those here. Right, and go up a little bit. Let me put this correctly. And this one as well. Let me save this entirely. Okay, now I have saved this, and now I'm going to be creating the TS file of the same component. I've already imported the material table module. What I'm going to do now is basically going to be creating the entire component. So let me put all the other imports over here. And I'm also going to be needing some import from the Angular core, which is essentially the component, because component is what we're going to be building in this particular file. So let's just put this here, save it. I'm going to be creating a selector here, so just ignore this for a moment and I'll cover this in the next few minutes, but just follow along in this particular tutorial, right? So the next one is I'm going to be writing the annotation, which is the component, and inside this annotation I'm going to be writing if this is a standalone component or not. In our case, it is going to be a standalone component. And I'm also going to be importing a material table module, as you can see here at the line number 11. And I'm also going to be making the template URL for students table component HTML and CSS as well, right? So let me just save this right here. And the next thing I'm going to be putting in is the export class student table. So let me just write down this and go here, and let me just do the constructor. Inside the constructor, I'm going to be importing the store. So let me just write it down here. Come next, and here I'm going to be putting in the ng on in it. But before that, I'll have to really implement the on in it. And put this here. Right, and we have done for this store. So now we have seen that we have already written the ng on in it. Now, if you let me, before I do anything, let me just split this string into two equal half and show you what we have written basically in the HTML page. So if you go at the top of the page, you would realize that the data source is something which a property which is basically needed in order to display the grid over here. So the data source is not really available inside the component just yet. And if you scroll down further, you would notice that we will have to basically also put the display column, the column related details over here in order to show the footer. So display columns and also the data source, which is basically required to run this particular grid very well. So let me just write it down here. So firstly, we're going to be making an arrangement in order to receive the data source. So now we have also seen that basically in order to read the state, we really need to write down the selector. And selector is something that we're going to be writing in a little while later. But then before we write the selector, we also really need to understand that the selector are nothing but the asynchronous or the stream of data. And then we would basically have to read the data just the way we read the regular subjects. Basically, we will have to subscribe to those. And once you subscribe to those, whatever value that you receive, this is something which we will be storing inside the data sources, right? So let me write down the data source logic first. So here you may have also noticed that I've written a store, imported a store here in the constructor. So I'm going to be writing in the select all. And now I also need to write down logic for display columns. So display columns, and this display column is going to be of type string array. So, and this string array is going to be having all the properties which are basically required for your grid to display the details under, and these all details are stored in an array format. So it's going to be the string array. So you can see that all the properties, all the objects inside, or all the values inside this array are of type string. Let me save this. Now come here in the ng on it again, once again, and then here in the ng on it, I'm going to be reading that stream, right? So this dot data source dollar dot subscribe, and inside the subscribe I'm going to be writing a logic, the logic which is basically used in order to receive the data value inside it. So let me just copy this bit completely from here and put it down here. And also need to declare the data source very right at the top. Right, so this bit is done. We've also declared the display columns, and let me just quickly look at the component once again and see if there's any error. Now you can see that the component is error free and the HTML part of it is absolutely error free, and so is the TS file for that particular component. However, there is still some red leaves being shown at the line number 6. So what are those? So here you will basically have to write student selector, and this student selector is basically coming from the state. So let me write down that logic as well. Or before I write down that logic, let me just close everything over here. And then I already have created students-selectors.ts file inside it, right? So here in this file, I'm going to be writing a logic which is basically required for my component to read data and display it, right? So how do we write logic inside it? So selector, I'm going to be, before I write or explain anything about selector, as we have also already seen in the diagram earlier, or rather let me just take you back to the Chrome browser once again. And here in the Chrome browser, you would notice that here in the untitled, or here is the diagram that that depicts how we read store value using the selector in the component. So if you see my mouse here, or let me just let me draw something over here. So here is a selector we are going to be writing. So now you can see that the selector is the one which is basically reading the store value, which is here, and then passing it to the component. So if you need to read any data value inside the component, selector is a place to go. right? So now we understand this. So now let me take you back to the code editor, and here the code editor, we're going to be basically now writing a selector. So in order to write a selector, we really need to import a few methods from the ngrx store library. So how do we do that? Let me just write down that logic quickly. Import create selector from the rate ngrx / store. Let me save this bit here. Next line, I'm going to be writing the student's record. It's essentially the type. So correct the spelling as well. So here I'm going to be taking in this one, and this is being imported from the student's records. Now I'm going to be writing the interface for app state. So how do we write it? Let me just write down this thing. Student record, and now I'm going to be basically writing a method. Now I'm going to be writing the select feature. So how do we select a feature? So select feature is going to be a variable. That particular select feature is going to be a method, and that method is the method which is basically used inside the create selector method. So how do we write one? So let me write down method. Okay, so now we have written a particular method, the select feature method. The select feature method essentially accepts the app state and it returns the student's record slice from the app state, right? So now here I'm going to be writing that particular method, which I've imported the line number 1, which is a create selector. So using the create selector method, I'm going to be writing a select selector. So it's going to be with the name select all, and this select all is going to be from the create selector, and inside the create selector, and the first argument of it is going to be the feature that we really need to take a value from, and the second argument is basically the state, and I'm also going to be defining the type here. So students records array, and from the students records array, I'm just going to be returning the state per se here in the second argument, which is basically a method, right? So this is done as well. Let me put a semicolon at the end of the file. Yep. So no error at the console level, and here at the app level also we can see in all the files there is no error per se. So here, what's wrong? So it says state. Let me see if the path is correct. And it's to students selectors. This look like okay. All right, so let me just close down this. All right, so now we have written all the code which is required for us to write, and after this I'm going to be basically designing, or I'm basically going to be putting this particular method inside the app component. I'm just going to be putting this particular students stable component inside the app component. So let me open the app component.html. The app component.html, I'm just going to be putting in this, right? There's some error, and in order to put this here, I also really need to import this in the app component. So in order to have this here, let me just put a semicolon, you put a comma here, students table component. So now, all right, so it looks like we have generated the component properly and there's no error, at least in the console. So let me take you back to the web browser and see if things so far are working or not. So here is the students, and there you go. Right. So here you can see that the first logic of ours is working properly. So here essentially what we have done is that we have inflated a particular grid. This grid is a material grid or material table per se. This material table displays all these columns which we have for a particular student. So right now it has just one record, which is Deepak, Ajmer, India, Rajasthan, yes, so on and so forth. So our logic so far is working. Our initial logic looks like okay, and there is no console error here either. So let me just scan the Redux dev tool. So here, if you open the Redux dev tool and you look at the action, so now you can see that there are essentially two things that it has done. The first one is the init. The second action which was passed is basically to update the student's record. And here at the state also you could see that this is the state that we have currently. So here at the init level or at the top of the level, you can also basically go back and forth and see how things work. So this is all about selector that I've covered in this particular tutorial. I'm going to be talking about the other aspect of ngrx store in the next tutorial. But for now, I'm just going to be stopping this, and then I'll see you in the next one. And if you are liking my work, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Also hit the bell icon in case if I post a new video, you would be notified. Thanks again, ladies and gentlemen, once again, and I'll see you in the next one.